people always ask, is this the new normal? Well, we don't know what the new normal will be. We will only reach the new normal when we know what the global mean temperature is, when we finally stop burning fossil fuels.
For the first time, I felt the impacts of climate change, and I saw it with my eyes. I saw the retreat of glaciers, I saw the impact on the people and the impact on the wildlife.
You don't change the world by consuming this or that. You change the world by thinking about what world do you actually want to live in.
So I have been a meteorologist for 20 years. I started as a forecaster at the RAF, forecasting for pilots flying all over the world. And then a job came up at the BBC and I started talking about weather in the UK, weather around the world, and then I've been doing more of that across ITV. But I think that I fell in love with the weather because it's so changeable. And it's so changeable because of the jet stream. So when I was 14, my geography teacher taught us about the jet stream, and he lined up the girls in a straight line and the boys in a straight line, and he said, run across the classroom as fast as you can, bumping into each other, and see what happens when you get to the other side. By the time we got to the other side, we're all in a wiggly line, and he said, that is the jet stream. That is warm air from the south hitting cold air from the north, the two of them meeting and having this battleground. And in the UK, it's either under us, it's cold, on us, and it's wet, or above us, and it's warm. And instantly, at that age, I was like, I want to be a weather forecaster. So that day, I phoned the Met Office and said, how do I become a weather forecaster? And they were like, you need to do A-level maths and physics, which for a 14-year-old girl is not the best news in the world. But I did it, and I loved it. And I think that we just love to talk about the weather. Like the stat is, I think that at any one point in the day, a third of the UK is talking about the weather. And probably today, when everyone's just like, wow, it's really warm. Why is it so warm? You're really asking that. As coming up from the south. I just think it's a conversation we love. And so I love that my job is to tell people about the weather every day. And I love science. And I think it's really important to add a sprinkle of science so people understand why the weather's doing what it's doing. But in my career, I've seen it changing. So in the newsroom at ITV where I work now, maybe about 10 years ago, I'd say to them, oh, there's been this record temperature. We should talk about this. And they'd go, oh, yeah, let's put it in the news. And then maybe like 5 years ago, I'd be like, there's been this record temperature and this record flood and this. And they're like, oh, you're coming with too many records, Laura. You know, maybe let's just pick the really good ones. And then in more recent years, more extreme weather, more record temperatures, more record rainfall, more droughts. And it's come to a point where we can't report all of them because actually, if you do them too often, they don't have the same impact on people. So we do have to choose the good ones that have the best pictures or the highest fatalities, which is really sad. And actually, it's when you join the dots and you go, okay, more often we're seeing these weather events, it must be climate change. When I was a junior forecaster, my boss told me, never forecast a record because they've stood for hundreds of years or longer for a reason, and now they seem to be happening so often. So for me, I think it must be climate change, but then this is where Fredi comes in to tell us what's actually happening.
Yeah, I think actually for us, when I started World Weather Attribution, which I founded together with a colleague who passed away 3 years ago, there was the science of attribution, so that you can actually link an individual weather event with climate change and say this event has been made 10 times more likely, or this rainfall was 10% more intense because of climate change. That was a very new science. There were only a handful of studies really out in the scientific world. And when I was at a science conference in San Francisco, where every year the biggest climate science community conference in the world is happening, and I was at that conference, and then someone from Climate Central, who is an NGO an NGO in the US, and they provide actually scientific information for meteorology broadcasters to help them to make the science connection. And they asked me, can you do these studies faster, please? And I was thinking, not sure. And then talking to my colleague, and he was, yeah, sure, we can do that, no problem. and so that was how we founded World Weather Attribution. And with the first study, we did basically on the annual temperatures 2014, in December 2014, and then in 2015 we really started doing these studies. And at first it still took us a while to figure out how to do this fast, how to do the science well, and also then how, once we have done that, how to get this information out to actually the people like you who can then use it.
Yeah.
But we are now at a point where when we started, it was, as you said, there's an interesting record, let's talk about this. But now there are so many events and so many records that we actually had to have decided a few years ago, okay, we have to be much more systematic into which kind of events we do studies on, because we can't do studies on all of them. And so we have from the start worked with the Red Cross, and we can talk about a bit later why. And so we have decided to focus on events that have huge humanitarian impact, so events that are important for people, because that is why we care about climate change, because it impacts people, because it takes lives and livelihoods. And so we have, for each type of event, like floods, for example, we have a criteria. So if there are more than 100 fatalities, or more than 1 million people affected, or more than 50% of the population of a country affected, then we consider doing a study. And this year we had not a single week where we didn't have less than 3 events triggered of this type. And so of course we can't do 3 events in 1 week, so we still have to choose. And we are now trying to choose the ones where there are in regions in the world where there are not so many studies yet. But we have the same problem that we just did a press briefing this morning about devastating floods in Nepal. And you would think that people, even who are not living in Nepal, are interested in that, because it's a country that's a really famous tourist destination. But because we just had the 2 cyclones, Helen and Milton, in the US before, the media is sort of done with it. And so we had very, very little pickup. So it's really difficult to still keep people talking about it. But we have to talk about it.
I know. So what we were going to do was run through some extreme weather events that were either very memorable for me or for you, or would be very memorable for you guys who would have seen them watching from home. And the first one is, and it's from 3 years ago, but it was from a town called Lytton in Canada. So it's pretty much the same latitude as we are in the UK. And they got to nearly 50 degrees Celsius. I'll put that into context. We have reached 40 degrees in the UK, and that in itself was extreme. That is hotter than it's been in LA, which is 1,000 miles further south. And they broke their record by nearly 5 degrees Celsius. So when I said, my boss said never forecast a record to be broken because it stands for a long time for a reason, even if you break a record, you maybe break it by 1/10 of a degree, 100th of a degree. A degree would be exceptional, but nearly 5 degrees was just off the scale. It's, for me, we're kind of thinking about the analogy of Usain Bolt. If he came out and he's run the 100 meters in 9.8 seconds, if he ran it in 7 seconds, you'd go, wow, this is not possible. It's not possible. No human's ever going to be able to run that fast. That was what the equivalent of this temperature record having been smashed. And then the devastating thing was, it was so hot that the very next day there was a wildfire and 90% of the town burnt down. And that extreme temperature caused that impact somewhere that is in a world where we care about the world and places we would know, somewhere that's closer to home, feels like somewhere that could be the UK. And your guys' attribution study for that was crazy.
Yeah, so we did an attribution study. So the first thing when you do an attribution study is you have to characterize what is actually the event you care about. So in this case, it was what was really, as you said, what was really the most striking and what caused really the impacts were the absolutely high maximum temperatures. So we choose a region which included Luton and also other parts that were sitting under this. It was called the heat dome at the time, under this heat dome. And then the second step, after you've decided how to characterize the event, you look at, okay, what kind of event is that in the world we live in today? So in the world that is already, or was at the time, 1.2 degrees warmer than it would have been without climate change. So in other words, what is possible weather in the world we live in today? And to do that, we look at observations, which in the US is very easy because it has a very dense observational network, and also the data is shared across the world. And there are also other observational products that are globally available that we can look at. And we use also climate models because, of course, observations, you only have about 100 years worth of data. But when you look at an event like this, you know it's not anywhere in the record. So you need more data to be able to estimate what kind of event that is. And with the models and the statistical models that we had, we estimated that even in today's world, it's still a very rare event. It would only be expected with a sort of at the climate of 2021, roughly with every 1,000 years. But of course, there's pretty high uncertainty around that with only 100 years worth of data to make that estimate. But without climate change, and this is the next step and the real attribution step, so we then ask the question, what is possible weather in the world without climate change? And we can ask this question actually, or answer this question very well, because we know very precisely how many greenhouse gases have been put into the atmosphere in addition since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So we can take these out of climate models atmospheres, and we can also use statistical models and say, okay, what's possible weather if the globe was 1.2 degrees cooler? And we found that without climate change, this event is impossible. So you would never, even statistically, you would never get such an event. So these high temperatures were only made possible because of climate change. So this is, I mean, we have since actually done a few more heatwave studies where we found similar results because, of course, it's already 3 years ago. There was 3 years worth more of increasing greenhouse gas emissions. So we see this now more and more, but that was the first time we found a result where it is impossible without climate change.
And then the projections are scary too.
Yes, and of course we can use the same method that we use to look into the past and say, what's the role of climate change? How have things changed since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution? We can say, okay, and if we now had a 2-degree world, so from today's climate, 0.7 degrees warmer than today, how likely would such an event be? And that statistic is really scary because in a 2-degree world, such an extreme heat wave we would expect to see every 5 to 10 years. So for heat waves, climate change is an absolute game changer. And we now see lots and lots of events that, we would have not thought could actually happen.
Yeah. And so that's what's really useful for me in my job now, that I can communicate that to our audience. That's why we want them rapidly. Because if I said to my newsroom 2 weeks later, hey, I've got a study about that heat wave, it's like, what heat wave? So long ago. So obviously the quicker the better. But you need to say to people who don't believe or don't think it's that bad, like you say, you strip out all of the emissions we've put in. How much can we attribute our warming to it? That temperature was virtually impossible. And now it's happening every 1,000 years. So by the end of the century, in the best case scenario, it'd be happening every 5 to 10 years. So for me, what is scary is that what was once impossible is now not even possible. It's becoming more likely. That is terrifying. So that was rainfall. That was temperature. The next one I'll come on to is rainfall. So this time last year, Libya had a colossal amount of rainfall. There was a storm moving its way through Europe, and they saw 1 year's worth of rainfall in a day. It's obvious a year's worth of rainfall in a day is not a normal thing to happen. There were 11,000 fatalities that they know of. There are a number of things that came together in a really bad way to make the impact so much worse and so many fatalities. Early warnings, which is something I'm going to come on to later, but I'll say now. So only half the world have weather warnings. And we are so lucky that we get warned about extreme weather. It's not as bad, obviously, in the UK. We look in America, people can evacuate, they can take action to save their lives. In Libya, they had a very good forecast. They knew what was coming, that they didn't have the warning network and the broadcasting network and the right government and the right infrastructure in place to warn people in the area we knew were going to be really flooded to then be able to evacuate and to save their lives. But a year's worth of rain obviously doesn't seem normal, but what was your study?
Yeah, so we also did a study on this. The storm was called Daniel, and it hit Libya and Greece, and also some other parts of the Mediterranean, but those were the most affected countries. And for rainfall, the numbers might not seem quite so shocking, because for a rainfall event, we found in this case that climate change doing exactly the same thing again, characterizing the event, looking at possible weather with and without climate change. We found that climate change increased the rainfall associated with this storm by about 50%, which is a lot of rainfall. It's not quite so dramatic changes as with temperature, but it still means life and death for a lot of people, and whether a street is flooded or not, or whether a dam breaks or not. And it was not, of course, with Libya, it was not only that there was no early warning, it was also that these huge number of fatalities was because of a dam breaking, and that dam had not been maintained for the last 20 years, because obviously Libya is a war-torn country. And I think the same storm also hit Greece, and there were 17 fatalities in Greece, which is still too many people losing their lives. But it shows just what the difference in vulnerability and between a relatively well-prepared country and a totally unprepared country can mean in terms of lives saved.
Yeah, it's crazy. I'll come on to another heat one. So for us in the UK, 2 years ago, we broke 40 degrees Celsius. So I am 40 now, and I'm, how long is my broadcast career going to go on? Who knows? But when I did a TV show with ITV called Tonight about 5 years ago, I did a package looking at what the UK summers would look like in 2050. I might just still be doing my job then. And we were looking that the summer in the UK, under a medium scenario, the kind of trajectory we're heading, we would have temperatures in the north into the low 30s, and in the south we would get to 40 degrees Celsius. So I have a map of me standing in front of this weather map with a pretend future of summer 2050, saying we'd get to 40 degrees Celsius. And then 2 summers ago, we were actually forecasting that in real life. And I remember the computer models about 10 days out saying a few were highlighting that we could get a 40. And there was a veteran forecaster that we had called John Mitchell, who's our Canada presenter. He was just retiring like that week. And on our weather WhatsApp group, we were like, John, we're really worried. It's saying it's going to be 40 degrees. And he was literally like, come on, kids, don't worry. I know it says it's going to be 40, but it's not going to be. Not going to be in our lifetimes, but it's scary that the science says, the models say it could happen. And then as we got closer and closer, more and more of the computer models were saying the same thing. And then we were like, oh no, it looks like it's going to happen. I'm going to be saying we're going to be reaching 40 degrees Celsius. And PS, the previous record temperature in the UK is 38.7. So we're in that scenario again where we're breaking a temperature record by a huge number. And then I said to my news team, because I was watching some broadcasters reporting from beaches and from people in parks with deck chairs, and I was saying, we need to treat this as a severe weather story, the same as we would a storm, heavy rainfall, strong winds. I said, everyone needs to be in the studio. We need to be talking about going to a zoo where they're making efforts to save animals and look after them, and how it's impacting humans in different ways. So we had warnings, first of all, that were saying very old, very young will be affected by the temperature, and it became a warning that the whole nation, no matter whether you're healthy or unhealthy, would be impacted by these extreme temperatures. And the morning of the Tuesday, I remember I stood up and I broadcast, my weather is normal at 6:15, and I said, today we're going to be reaching 40 degrees Celsius. And afterwards, this might seem really strange, but I actually cried, because I thought to myself, I've said it. In my broadcast career, I genuinely didn't, 30 years ahead of what our studies were saying, actually just told people that happened. And there were huge fatalities across the UK and right across Europe. And again, your studies showed how extreme that was.
Yeah, so of course, we also had to do a study about that because it was literally on our doorstep, and we found again, not surprising, that climate change made this much more likely. It might have been just about possible as a, I don't know, 1 in 150,000 year event or so without climate change, but it's but
Virtually impossible.
Virtually impossible, yes. But with climate change, it is now something that is still in last year's climate and this year's climate. It's still relatively rare, so you don't expect this every year. But I think what's really important to highlight also with your story, that when you were looking at the 2050, of course, people always ask, is this the new normal? Well, we don't know what the new normal will be. We will only reach the new normal when we know what the global mean temperature is, when we finally stop burning fossil fuels. But of course, if a new normal is that you have 40 degrees as a regular thing in British summers, which will be the case definitely in a 2-degree world, the new extremes will be something completely different. And the new extremes will be something that we really can see, but that we can see in climate models, but that we can't really imagine. And I think that's also why the fatalities are still so high, even though we have good weather forecasts. And in the UK actually did also a really good job in warning people that this is dangerous, but still in those 2 days, more than 3,000 people in just the southern UK region lost their lives. And that's because if you haven't experienced something like that, it's really hard to make sense of the warnings and the forecasts. And so, yeah, it is, early warning is important, but and we have also seen that 3 years ago, there was extremely heavy rainfall and flooding in Germany that had a very high death toll. And that was, I mean, no early warning existed. So we had the flood forecast, very well forecast, but it actually, as in the same case as in Libya, actually, it did not reach people. There was no evacuation warnings. There was no understanding that this could actually be deadly. And I think that's really one of the most important lessons learned from all this work on extreme weather events, is that the most important adaptation measure that we can take is early action, not just early warning, but then having drills, having really that everyone in all the chains of command knows and has practiced what to do and how to get people to safety in everywhere in the world.
And that leads on nicely to the hurricanes from the last few weeks and the mandatory evacuations from Milton last week in Florida, which actually, as an aside, I remember there was a big, there was police cars going down roads shouting, if you are not going to evacuate the area, write your name on your arm, write another phone number for somebody to be contacted. And I was thinking, these people have been told there's a mandatory evacuation, a record storm. It strengthened from a tropical storm to a Category 5 faster than any hurricane in the Atlantic Basin has done. That's another record being broken. But then there was loads of reports about people are very poorly, they're unable to go, they don't have access to vehicles, they can't leave. They're worried about displacement. From Katrina, 1.5 million people evacuated, and nearly 500,000 of them have still not returned to their homes. So there are so many reasons that people just can't leave. And there were only, and it's terrible, 16 fatalities. Lots of people going to me, it wasn't that bad, not that many people died. And I was like, did you see the highways of so many people leaving? Millions, 5.9 million were under the mandatory evacuation. And you see whole trailers on roofs. You see there was a condo that was this, like the roof was sticking out that much, the rest of it was sand. And there was a 15-foot storm surge. You know, these were conditions that were unsurvivable. And you'll have seen a broadcaster, John Morales, I have another world WhatsApp group, and he's in my little WhatsApp group. And, he was saying about the pressures, and he was looking at the reports, and he had the stats come in about how rapidly the storm was deepening. And he was saying words, as a veteran forecaster, he couldn't believe he was saying, and that's why he was so moved. And then later on, he put out a tweet apologizing because he felt it was really unprofessional. We're not journalists and reporters, we're scientists telling you science, and occasionally it just kind of takes you aback. But I mean, those two hurricanes were again made more extreme because of climate change.
Yes, so those hurricanes, and this is something which actually is a sort of breakthrough in the science also that we've done this year. That before that, when we're looking at hurricanes, we were looking either we were usually just looking at the rainfall associated with the hurricanes. But this year, we, and together also with groups of scientists in the US, have done really looking at almost all the individual pieces of a hurricane. So the first thing, hurricanes only happen when you have very high sea surface temperatures. So so that's obviously one aspect of hurricanes where climate change plays a massive role, because we have this huge increase in temperatures over land, but also over the ocean. But then whether or not these hurricanes actually become hurricanes and can sustain their energy also depends on what we call the wind shear. So whether the winds higher up in the atmosphere, because if it's windy there, then the hurricane doesn't really develop and will break down. So the conditions are you need high surface temperatures and then relatively stable atmosphere. And then you can develop these hurricanes can develop. And this measure, combining the sea surface temperatures with the atmosphere, is called potential intensity. And so we found that for the sea surface temperatures, you have about a 500 times increase in the likelihood. But for the hurricanes overall, you have about a doubling in the potential intensity. So that takes these two things together. And then we looked at the wind speeds and the rainfall and found that both have increased by about 10%. So climate change made the wind speeds about 10% more intense, and also the rainfall for these two storms, Helene and Milton.
And so I guess the big question is, what can we do? Can we do anything that's going to make a difference? I mean, I was reporting obviously on the heavy rainfall we've had in the UK lately. We've had flooding, and there was a big report out, because it's Flood Action Week this week, to say that I think 5.2 million people are at risk of flooding in the UK and don't know. You can sign up to the flood warnings completely for free. You pop your postcode in and it will tell you. And if you're at risk of flooding, you get a text. And then you can start to take action. Like you say, you can move your belongings upstairs. If you are, then when you go through your flood alert, flood warning to severe flood warning, that's when you would turn your electricity off and then vacate your property or move upstairs if you needed to. Those things are important to save your property and to save yourselves. But then investing in flood protection. So for every £1 that's spent on flood prevention, it saves £5 for the after event, for clearing up after a storm has happened, which will be very similar to what happened in Germany after that huge storm.
Well, you would hope, but I think there is. You would hope that then this investment in the flood protection is done, and I think there is a huge amount that we can do. I mean, the most important thing is to stop burning fossil fuels, because otherwise it will just get worse, and I think in order to do this. I mean, lots of people feel, they can't do anything about this because we need globally an agreement. But I think the biggest hindrance to get to that at the moment is that we still have the completely wrong narrative about the world we want to live in. We always talk about climate change as if the status quo, so the world we live in today, is the best of all possible worlds. We never talk about what actually is a world we want to live in. And so therefore, because we never talk about what world we want to live in, everything is, something is taken away from you. If you're not allowed your private car, then something is taken away from you. But it's not, well, actually, I do want to live in a world where I don't need to worry about my life every time I cross a road, or where I don't die from air pollution in the cities. So I think we really need to change this narrative around, and that's something that needs lots and lots of people and all sorts of spheres of society. So that is something that everyone can do. And don't believe you're just a consumer. I mean, that you don't change the world by consuming this or that. You change the world by thinking about what world do you actually want to live in and then move towards that. I think that's a big mistake that we all still make. And then, of course, there's lots of things that we can do in terms of adaptation. We've already talked about early warning. You brought the example of Germany. I mean, Germany has now invested a lot in early warning that actually reaches people, but they also have rebuilt the city in exactly the same way as it was before.
Oh no.
Completely concrete and asphalt everywhere. So the next time there will be a heavy rainfall event, the houses will flood again. So there are also some lessons that are very hard to be learned, but that are actually relatively straightforward, that if the water has nowhere to go in the ground, it will go into your house.
Yeah. And I think you hit on it there. I think for me, when I talk about climate change and things you can do, it's multi-benefits. So, I walk home with my daughter from school. It takes a really long time, but it's free to walk. We're breathing summer fresh air. We're looking at animals. We're picking up ladybirds. And it's a really lovely thing to do. And when I went to Svalbard to look at climate change, we discussed whether I needed to fly to the Arctic to talk about how emissions are rising global temperature and increasing extreme weather. But we took a minimal crew, and actually for the first time I felt the impacts of climate change, and I saw it with my eyes. I saw the retreat of glaciers. I saw the impact on the people and the impact on the wildlife. And then I stood at the edge of a glacier that had retreated 1/2 a mile in 40 years. I was turning 40 that week, and I thought, wow, when I come back with my daughter in 40 years, where will this glacier end? Could this be the best case scenario, or will it have retreated another 1/2 a mile or more up the road? And I met a guy there called Kim Holman, who's the head of the Norwegian Polar Institute, and he said, there is nothing that we can do to tackle climate change that is a negative. When people think they have to give up this or not do that, it's a real shame. If you were to say to people, can you give up meat 1 day a week? It's the equivalent of reducing the emissions of 16 million cars in 1 year, but it will make you healthier. It is also cheaper to eat vegetables than it is to eat meat. And I know at ITV we had this funny thing. They introduced Meat-Free Monday up in the Manchester offices, and there was outrage. You're taking our meat away from us. And then about 6 months later, they introduced Tasty Tuesday, which was also meat-free, and everyone loved it, because they didn't feel that they were having something taken away from them. And everyone now goes home and they have meat-free days, and they're really happy. So I just think it's, like you said, starting with small changes, getting bigger. And me as a meteorologist, I used to say, these extreme weather events are becoming more likely because of climate change. Well, pretty much every time they happen, they already are more likely because of climate change. A warm atmosphere holds more moisture. And now I would try and link it to, yet again, we've had a record temperature because we're burning fossil fuels. If we reduce one, we reduce the other. And it's trying to just get that into the narrative as well, isn't it? So I feel like there's hope, but we have a long way to go.